Chapter 7, Juan Fernandez, the Pacific. We continued sailing along with a fair wind and fine weather until Tuesday, November 25th, when at daylight we saw the island of Juan Fernandez, directly ahead, rising like a deep blue cloud out of the sea. We were then probably nearly 70 miles from it, and so high and so blue did it appear, that I mistook it for a cloud resting over the island and looked for the island under it, until it gradually turned to a deader and greener color, and I could mark the inequalities upon its surface. At length we could distinguish trees and rocks, and by the afternoon this beautiful island lay fairly before us, and we directed our course to the only harbor. Arriving at the entrance soon after sundown, we found a Chilean man-of-war brig, the only vessel coming out. She hailed us, and an officer on board, whom we supposed to be an American, advised us to run in before night, and said that they were bound to Valparaiso. We ran immediately for the anchorage, but owing to the winds, which drew about the mountains and came to us in flaws from every point of the compass, we did not come to an anchor until nearly midnight. We had a boat ahead all the time that we were working in, and those aboard were continually bracing the yards about for every puff that struck us, until about 12 o'clock, when we came to in 40 fathoms water, and our anchor struck bottom for the first time since we left Boston, 103 days. We were then divided into 3 watches, and thus stood out the remainder of the night. I was called on deck to stand my watch at about 3 in the morning, and I shall never forget the peculiar sensation which I experienced on finding myself once more surrounded by land, feeling the night breeze coming from offshore and hearing the frogs and crickets. The mountains seemed almost to hang over us, and apparently from the very heart of them there came out, at regular intervals, a loud echoing sound which affected me as hardly human. We saw no lights and could hardly account for the sound until the mate, who had been there before, told us that it was the, quote, alerta, end of quote, of the Chilean soldiers who were stationed over some convicts confined in caves nearly halfway up the mountain. At the expiration of my watch, I went below, feeling not a little anxious for the day, that I might see more nearly, and perhaps tread upon, this romantic, I may almost say classic, island. When all hands were called, it was nearly sunrise, and between that time and breakfast, although quite busy on board and getting up water casks, etc., I had a good view of the objects about me. The harbor was nearly landlocked, and at the head of it was a landing place protected by a small breakwater of stones, upon which 2 large boats were hauled up with a sentry standing over them. Near this was a variety of huts or cottages, nearly 100 in number, the best of them built of mud and whitewashed, but the greater part only Robinson Crusoe-like, of posts and branches of trees. The governor's house, as it is called, was the most conspicuous, being large, with grated windows, plastered walls, and roof of red tiles, yet, like all the rest, only of 1 story. Near it was a small chapel, distinguished by a cross, and a long, low, brown-looking building surrounded by something like a palisade, from which an old and dingy-looking Chilean flag was flying. This, of course, was dignified by the title of Presidio. A sentinel was stationed at the chapel, another at the governor's house, and a few soldiers armed with bayonets, looking rather ragged, with shoes out at the toes, were strolling about among the houses, or waiting at the landing place for our boat to come ashore. The mountains were high, but not so overhanging as they appeared to me by starlight. They seemed to bear off towards the center of the island, and were green and well wooded with some large, and I am told, exceedingly fertile valleys, with mule tracks leading to different parts of the island. I cannot here forget how my friend S and myself got the laugh of the crew upon us by our eagerness to get on shore. The captain having ordered the quarter boat to be lowered, we both sprang down into the forecastle, filled our jacket pockets with tobacco to barter with the people ashore, and when the officer called for, quote, 4 hands in the boat, end of quote, nearly broke our necks in our haste to be first over the side, and had the pleasure of pulling ahead of the brig with a tow line for a half an hour, and coming on board again to be laughed at by the crew who had seen our maneuver. After breakfast, the second mate was ordered ashore with 5 hands to fill the water casks, and to my joy I was among the number. We pulled ashore with the empty casks, and here again fortune favored me, for the water was too thick and muddy to be put into the casks. And the governor had sent men up to the head of the stream to clear it out for us, which gave us nearly 2 hours of leisure. This leisure we employed in wandering about among the houses and eating a little fruit which was offered to us. Ground apples, melons, grapes, strawberries of an enormous size, and cherries abound here. The latter are said to have been planted by Lord Anson. The soldiers were miserably clad, and asked with some interest whether we had shoes to sell on board. I doubt very much if they had the means of buying them. They were very eager to get tobacco, for which they gave shells, fruit, etc. Knives also were in demand, but we were forbidden by the governor to let any one have them, as he told us that all the people there, except the soldiers and a few officers, were convicts sent from Valparaiso, and that it was necessary to keep all weapons from their hands. The island, it seems, belongs to Chile, and had been used by the government as a sort of Botany Bay for nearly 2 years. And the governor, an Englishman who had entered the Chilean Navy, with a priest, 6 taskmasters, and a body of soldiers, were stationed there to keep them in order. This was no easy task, and only a few months before our arrival, a few of them had stolen a boat at night, boarded a brig lying in the harbor, sent the captain and crew ashore in their boat, and gone off to sea. We were informed of this and loaded our arms and kept strict watch on board through the night, and were careful not to let the convicts get our knives from us when on shore. The worst part of the convicts, I found, were locked up under sentry in caves dug into the side of the mountain, nearly halfway up, with mule tracks leading to them, whence they were taken by day and set to work under taskmasters upon building an aqueduct, a wharf, and other public works, while the rest lived in the houses which they put up for themselves, had their families with them, and seemed to me to be the laziest people on the face of the earth. They did nothing but take a paseo into the woods, a paseo among the houses, a paseo at the landing place, looking at us and our vessel, and too lazy to speak fast, while the others were driving, or rather driven, about at a rapid trot, in single file, with burdens on their shoulders, and followed up by their taskmasters, with long rods in their hands and broad-brimmed straw hats upon their heads. Upon what precise grounds this great distinction was made, I do not know, and I could not very well know, for the governor was the only man who spoke English upon the island, and he was out of my walk. Having filled our casks, we returned on board, and soon after the governor, dressed in a uniform like that of an American militia officer, the padre, in the dress of the Grey Friars, with hood and all complete, and the capitan, with big whiskers and dirty regimentals, came on board to dine. While at dinner, a large ship appeared in the offing, and soon afterwards we saw a light whaleboat pulling into the harbor. The ship lay off and on, and a boat came alongside of us and put on board the captain, a plain young Quaker dressed all in brown. The ship was the Cortez, whaleman of New Bedford, and had put in to see if there were any vessels from around the Horn, and to hear the latest news from America. They remained aboard a short time and had a little talk with the crew, when they left us and pulled off to their ship, which, having filled away, was soon out of sight. A small boat which came from the shore to take away the governor and suite, as they styled themselves, brought as a present to the crew a large pail of milk, a few shells, and a block of sandalwood. The milk, which was the first we had tasted since leaving Boston, we soon dispatched. A piece of the sandalwood I obtained, and learned that it grew on the hills in the center of the island. I have always regretted that I did not bring away other specimens of the products of the island, having afterwards lost all that I had with me, the piece of sandalwood and a small flower which I plucked and brought on board in the crown of my tarpaulin and carefully pressed between the leaves of a book. About an hour before sundown, having stowed our water casks, we commenced getting under way and were not a little while about it. For we were in 30 fathoms water, and in one of the gusts, which came from offshore, had let go our other bow anchor. And as the southerly wind draws round the mountains and comes off in uncertain flaws, we were continually swinging round, and had thus got a very foul house. We hove in upon our chain, and after stopping and unshackling it again and again, and hoisting and hauling down sail, we at length tipped our anchor and stood out to sea. It was bright starlight when we were clear of the bay, and the lofty island lay behind us in its still beauty, and I gave a parting look and bid farewell to the most romantic spot of earth that my eyes had ever seen. I did then and have ever since felt an attachment for that island altogether peculiar. It was partly, no doubt, from its having been the first land that I had seen since leaving home, and still more from the associations which everyone has connected with it in their childhood from reading Robinson Crusoe. To this I may add the height and romantic outlines of its mountains, the beauty and freshness of its verdure, and the extreme fertility of its soil, and its solitary position in the midst of the wide expanse of the South Pacific, as all concurring to give it its peculiar charm. When thoughts of this place have occurred to me at different times, I have endeavored to recall more particulars with regard to it. It is situated in about 33 degrees 30 feet south, and is distant a little more than 300 miles from Valparaiso, on the coast of Chile, which is in the same latitude. It is about 15 miles in length and 5 in breadth. The harbor in which we anchored, called by Lord Anson Cumberland Bay, is the only one in the island. 2 small bights of land on each side of the main bay, sometimes dignified by the name of bays, being little more than landing places for boats. The best anchorage is at the western side of the bay, where we lay at about 3 cables' lengths from the shore in a little more than 30 fathoms water. This harbor is open to the north-northeast, and in fact nearly from north to east, but the only dangerous winds being the southwest, on which side are the highest mountains. It is considered very safe. The most remarkable thing perhaps about it is the fish with which it abounds. 2 of our crew, who remained on board, caught in a few minutes enough to last us for several days. And one of the men, who was a Marblehead man, said that he never saw or heard of such an abundance. There were cod, breams, silverfish, and other kinds whose names they did not know, or which I have forgotten. There is an abundance of the best of water upon the island, small streams running through every valley and leaping down from the sides of hills. One stream of considerable size flows through the center of the lawn upon which the houses are built, and furnishes an easy and abundant supply to the inhabitants. This, by means of a short wooden aqueduct, was brought quite down to our boats. The convicts had also built something in the way of a breakwater and were to build a landing place for boats and goods, after which the Chilean government intended to lay port charges. Of the wood, I can only say that it appeared to be abundant. The island in the month of November, when we were there, being in all the freshness and beauty of spring, appeared covered with trees. These were chiefly aromatic, and the largest was the myrtle. The soil is very loose and rich, and wherever it is broken up, there spring up presently radishes, turnips, ground apples, and other garden fruits. I'll reread that. The soil is very loose and rich, and wherever it is broken up, there spring up presently radishes, turnips, ground apples, and other garden fruits. Goats, we were told, were not abundant, and we saw none, though it was said we might if we had gone into the interior. We saw a few bullocks winding about in the narrow tracks upon the sides of the mountains, and the settlement was completely overrun with dogs of every nation, kindred, and degree. Hens and chickens were also abundant, and seemed to be taken good care of by the women. The men appeared to be the laziest people upon the face of the earth. And indeed, as far as my observation goes, there are no people to whom the newly invented Yankee word of quote-unquote loafer is more applicable than to Spanish Americans. These men stood about doing nothing, with their cloaks, little better in texture than an Indian's blanket, but of rich colors, thrown over their shoulders with an air which it is said that a Spanish beggar can always give to his rags, and with great politeness and courtesy in their address, though with holes in their shoes and without a sou in their pockets. The only interruption to the monotony of their day seemed to be when a gust of wind drew round between the mountains and blew off the boughs which they had placed for roofs to their houses, and gave them a few minutes' occupation in running about after them. One of these gusts occurred while we were ashore, and afforded us no little amusement at seeing the men look round, and if they found that their roofs had stood, conclude that they might stand too, while those who saw theirs blown off, after uttering a few Spanish oaths, gathered their cloaks over their shoulders and started off after them. However, they were not long gone, but soon returned to their habitual occupation of doing nothing. It is perhaps needless to say that we saw nothing of the interior, but all who have seen it give very glowing accounts of it. Our captain went with the governor and a few servants upon mules over the mountains, and upon their return I heard the governor request him to stop at the island on his passage home and offer him a handsome sum to bring a few deer with him from California, for he said that there were none upon the island, and he was very desirous of having it stocked. A steady though light southwesterly wind carried us well off from the island, and when I came on deck for the middle watch I could just distinguish it from its hiding, a few low stars in the southern horizon, though my unpracticed eye would hardly have known it for land. At the close of the watch a few trade wind clouds which had arisen, though we were hardly yet in their latitude, shut it out from our view, and the next day, Thursday, November 27th, upon coming on deck in the morning, We were again upon the wide Pacific and saw no more land until we arrived upon the western coast of the great continent. Thursday, November 27th. Upon coming on deck in the morning, we were again upon the wide Pacific and saw no more land until we arrived upon the western coast of the great continent of America. Chapter 8. Tarring Down, Daily Life, Going Aft, California. As we saw neither land nor sail from the time of leaving Juan Fernandez until our arrival in California, nothing of interest occurred except our own doings on board. We caught the southeast trades and ran before them for nearly 3 weeks without so much as altering a sail or bracing a yard. The captain took advantage of this fine weather to get the vessel in order for coming upon the coast. The carpenter was employed in fitting up a part of the steerage into a trade room. For our cargo, we now learned, was not to be landed, but to be sold by retail from on board. And this trade room was built for the samples and the lighter goods to be kept in as a place for the general business. In the meantime, we were employed in working upon the rigging. Everything was set up taut, the lower rigging rattled down, or rather rattled up, according to the modern fashion. An abundance of spun yarn and seizing stuff made, and finally, the whole standing rigging, fore and aft, was tarred down. This was my first essay at this latter business, and I had enough of it, for nearly all of it came upon my friend S. and myself. The men were needed at the other work, and M., the other young man who came out with us, was laid up with the rheumatism in his feet, and the boy Sam was rather too young and small for the business. And as the winds were light and regular, he was kept during most of the daytime at the helm, so that nearly all the tarring came upon us. We put on short duck frocks and, taking a small bucket of tar and a bunch of oakum in our hands, went aloft, one at the main royal masthead and the other at the fore, and began tarring down. This is an important operation and is usually done about once in 6 months in vessels upon a long voyage. It was done in our vessel several times afterwards, but by the whole crew at once and finished off in a day. But at this time, as most of it came upon 2 of us, and we were new at the business, it took us several days. In this operation, they always begin at the masthead and work down, tarring the shrouds, backstays, standing parts of the lifts, the ties, runners, etc., and go out to the yard arms and come in, tarring as they come, the lifts and foot ropes. Tarring the stays is more difficult and is done by an operation which the sailors call riding down. A long piece of rope, top gallant studding sail halyards, or something of the kind, is taken up to the masthead from which the stay leads, and rove through a block for a girt line, or as the sailors usually call it, a gant line. I can mark this. So full of fucking shit with the terminology. I'm going to reread those few sentences because, God, the jargon in this, like, I guess it would be safer not to know how to swim than to not know all these terms. Sorry, that was the reader talking, not the book. Back to these sentences of jargon. In this operation, they always begin at the masthead and work down, tarring the shrouds, backstays, standing parts of the lifts, the ties, runners, etc., and go out to the yard arms, and come in, tarring as they come the lifts and foot ropes. Tarring the strays is more difficult and is done by an operation which the sailors call riding down. A long piece of rope, top gallant studding sail halyards, or something of the kind, is taken up to the masthead from which the stay leads, and rove through a block for a girt line, or as the sailors usually call it, a gant line. God, bunch of bullshit. With the end of this, a bow line is taken round the stay, into which the man gets with his bucket of tar and a bunch of oakum, and the other end being fast on deck with someone to tend it, he is lowered down gradually, and tars the stay carefully as he goes. There he, quote, swings aloft twixt heaven and earth, end of quote. And if the rope slips, breaks, or is let go, or if the bow line slips, he falls overboard or breaks his neck. This, however, is a thing which never enters into a sailor's calculation. He only thinks of leaving no holidays, places not tarred, for in case he should, he would have to go over the whole again, or of dropping no tar upon the deck, for then there would be a soft word in his ear from the mate. In this manner I tarred down all the headstays, but found the rigging about the jib booms, martingale, and spitsail yard, upon which I was afterwards put the hardest. Here you have to hang on with your eyelids and tar with your hands. This dirty work could not last forever, and on Saturday night we finished it, scraped all the spots from the deck and rails, and what was more important to us, cleaned ourselves thoroughly, rolled up our tarry frocks and trousers, and laid them away for the next occasion, and put on our clean duck clothes, and had a good comfortable sailor's Saturday night. The next day was pleasant, and indeed we had but one unpleasant Sunday during the whole voyage, and that was off Cape Horn, where we could expect nothing better. On Monday we commenced painting and getting the vessel ready for the port. This work, too, is done by the crew, and every sailor who has been on long voyages is a little of a painter, in addition to his other accomplishments. We painted her, both inside and out, from the truck to the water's edge. The outside is painted by lowering stages over the side by ropes, and on those we sat with our brushes and paint pots by us, and our feet half the time in the water. This must be done, of course, on a smooth day when the vessel does not roll much. I remember very well being over the side painting in this way one fine afternoon, our vessel going quietly along at the rate of 4 or 5 knots, and a pilot fish, the sure precursor of a shark, swimming alongside of us. The captain was leaning over the rail watching him, and we went quietly on with our work. In the midst of our painting, on Friday, December 19th, we crossed the equator for the second time. I had the feeling, which all have when for the first time, they find themselves living under an entire change of seasons. As, crossing the line under a burning sun in the midst of December, and, as I afterwards was, beating about among ice and snow on the 4th of July. Thursday, December 25th. This day was Christmas, but it brought us no holiday. The only change was that we had a, quote, plum duff, end of quote, for dinner. And the crew quarreled with the steward because he did not give us our usual allowance of molasses to eat with it. He thought the plums would be a substitute for the molasses. But we were not to be cheated out of our rights in this way. Such are the trifles which produce quarrels on shipboard. In fact, we had been too long from port. We were getting tired of one another and were in an irritable state both forward and aft. Our fresh provisions were, of course, gone, and the captain had stopped our rice so that we had nothing but salt beef and salt pork throughout the week, with the exception of a very small duff on Sunday. This added to the discontent, and 1,000 little things daily and almost hourly occurring, which no one who has not himself been on a long and tedious voyage can conceive of or properly appreciate. Little wars and rumors of wars, reports of things said in the cabin, misunderstanding of words and looks, apparent abuses, brought us into a state in which everything seemed to go wrong. Every encroachment upon the time allowed for rest appeared unnecessary. Every shifting of the studding sails was only to haze the crew. Haze is a word of frequent use on board ship and never, I believe, used elsewhere. It is very expressive to a sailor and means to punish by hard work. Let an officer once say, "I'll haze you," and your fate is fixed. You will be worked up if you are not a better man than he is. In the midst of this state of things, my messmate S and myself petitioned the captain for leave to shift our berths from the steerage, where we had previously lived, into the forecastle. This, to our delight, was granted, and we turned into bunk and mess with the crew forward. We now began to feel like sailors, which we never fully did when we were in the steerage. While there, however useful and active you may be, you are but a mongrel, a sort of afterguard and ship's cousin. You are immediately under the eye of the officers, cannot dance, sing, play, smoke, make a noise, or growl, i.e. complain, or take any other sailor's pleasure, and you live with the steward, who is usually a go-between, and the crew never feel as though you were one of them. But if you live in the forecastle, you are, quote, as independent as a wood saw's clerk, end of quote. Notice. And are a sailor. You hear sailors talk, learn their ways, their peculiarities of feeling as well as speaking and acting, and moreover pick up a great deal of curious and useful information in seamanship, ship's customs, foreign countries, etc., from their long yarns and equally long disputes. No man can be a sailor or know what sailors are unless he has lived in the forecastle with them, turned in and out with them, eaten of their dish and drank of their cup. After I had been a week there, nothing would have tempted me to go back to my old berth. And never afterwards, even in the worst of weather, when in a close and leaking forecastle off Cape Horn, did I for a moment wish myself in the steerage. Another thing which you learn better in the forecastle than you can anywhere else is to make and mend clothes, and this is indispensable to sailors. A large part of their watches below they spend at this work, and here I learned that art which stood me in so good stead afterwards. But to return to the state of the crew. Upon our coming into the forecastle, there was some difficulty about the uniting of the allowances of bread, by which we thought we were to lose a few pounds. This set us into a ferment. The captain would not condescend to explain, and we went aft in a body with a Swede, the oldest and best sailor of the crew, for spokesman. The recollection of the scene that followed always brings up a smile, especially the quarterdeck dignity and eloquence of the captain. He was walking the weather side of the quarterdeck, and seeing us coming aft, stopped short in his walk, and with a voice and look intended to annihilate us, called out, "Well, what the devil I do you want now?" whereupon we stated our grievances as respectfully as we could, but he broke in upon us, saying that we were getting fat and lazy, didn't have enough to do, and that made us find fault. This provoked us, and we began to give word for word. This would never answer. He clenched his fists, stamped and swore, and sent us all forward, saying, with oaths enough interspersed to send the words home, "Away with you! Go forward, every one of you! I'll haze you! I'll work you up! You don't have enough to do! If you ain't careful, I'll make a hell of the ship! You've mistaken your man! I'm F.T., all the way from down east. I've been through the mill, ground and bolted, and come out a regular built down east Johnny cake, good when it's hot, but when it's cold, sour, and indigestible, and you'll find me so." The latter part of this harangue I remember well, for it made a strong impression, and the down east Johnny cake became a byword for the rest of the voyage. So much for our petition for the redress of grievances. The matter was, however, set right. The matter was, however, set right, for the mate, after allowing the captain due time to cool off, explained it to him, and at night we were all called aft to hear another harangue, in which, of course, the whole blame of the misunderstanding was thrown upon us. We ventured to hint that he would not give us time to explain, but it wouldn't do. We were driven back discomfited. Thus the affair blew over, but the irritation caused by it remained, and we never had peace or a good understanding again so long as the captain and crew remained together. We continued sailing along in the beautiful temperate climate of the Pacific. The Pacific well deserves its name, for except in the southern part at Cape Horn and in the western parts near the China and Indian Oceans, it has few storms, and it is never either extremely hot or cold. Between the tropics, there is a slight haziness, like a thin gauze drawn over the sun, which, without obstructing or obscuring the light, tempers the heat which comes down with perpendicular fierceness in the Atlantic and Indian tropics. We sailed well to the westward to have the full advantage of the northeast trades, and when we had reached the latitude of Point Conception, where it is usual to make the land, we were several hundred miles to the westward of it. We immediately changed our course due east and sailed in that direction for a number of days. At length we began to heave to after dark, for fear of making the land at night on a coast where there are no lighthouses and but indifferent charts, and at daybreak on the morning of Tuesday, January 13th, 1835, we made the land at Point Conception, latitude 34 degrees, 32 feet north, long 120 degrees, 06 feet west. The port of Santa Barbara, to which we were bound, lying about 50 miles to the southward of this point. We continued sailing down the coast during the day and following night, and on the next morning, January 14th, 1835, we came to anchor in the spacious bay of Santa Barbara, after a voyage of 150 days from Boston.